Spray nozzles are a critical component in gas scrubbing systems. The systems themselves are complex and expensive and part of a bigger overall system, and they're essential. So as part of the specifying documents, the request for quotes, there will often be stringent testing and documentation requirements for all of the components within the scope of supply, including the spray nozzles. Now, it's also the case that the spray nozzles are a very small part of the overall system. So what we tend to have is a general documentation specification for all of the components within the system, and we'll often get a big tome specifying everything that needs to be done to comply with the documentation and testing requirements and all of the technical aspects of the solution. And buried in there'll be a few relevant pages that relate to the spray nozzle. And it can often be quite a task to actually get in there and work out exactly what it is we need to do. But this is what we do, and this is what we do every day, so we're used to that. But the fact that the spray nozzles are a relatively small part of the overall spec can lead to some problems when it comes to documentation. So this is 4 of the common testing and documentation problems that we run into and how they can be overcome or avoided. The first problem that we come across is irrelevant testing. So irrelevant testing and documentation requirements. So because the spray nozzles are a tiny component and there's maybe thousands of different components within the overall request for quote for the whole system, often the documentation and testing requirements are a kind of catch-all for all of the components, unless the person writing the document actually really understands the intricacies of spray nozzles and the intricacies of all of the other components in there. This catch-all documentation requirement can actually often lead to irrelevant testing requirements for something like spray nozzles. Classic example of this is when we get asked to do PED testing for just a basic spray nozzle supply. PED is the European pressure directive that covers any pressure containing vessels. Now, a nozzle on its own isn't a pressure containing vessel because it's by definition got a big hole in it, so no pressure is contained with it. And if we get asked, it's got to have a PED testing and certain spray nozzle. This is often irrelevant in our opinion. So there's a couple of ways we can avoid that. We can either spot that up front and have a discussion up front and get an exemption for it, present the logic, say no, this isn't a pressure containing vessel, you don't need to do this, can we get an exemption from that? Or do irrelevant tests on behalf of the customer. We'll talk about this up front with the customer. Often just doing a fudged kind of PED test just to say that it's been done. I mean, we'll do the test properly, but even though it's an irrelevant test, often that's actually cheaper than getting the exemption from the testing schedule, and that's obviously cheaper and less costly for the customer just to keep the process moving. So that's how we kind of overcome that. But it's best that if you discuss it up front, spot it up front, discuss it with the customer up front, then we can get that solved before it becomes an issue. Number 2, time delays. Now, often the time aspect of testing and documentation is forgotten about, but there are certain types of tests that can introduce delays into the process. Destructive testing, for example, if that's required, obviously the nozzles need to be manufactured and then they need to be sent away and then destructive testing needs to be done. That could take time, so we can add some time into the supply process. Another classic example is when customers want full material certs, full traceability of material, but they expect to kind of buy the product from stock. Stock nozzles have been maybe sat in our warehouse for a number of years. They're lumps of stainless steel, they don't go off. And they could be from different batches within the warehouse. So there isn't any way of having full material traceability on stock items often. So the customer comes for us for a quote and we say, yes, we've got them in stock, and then suddenly we can supply them within a couple of days, and then suddenly they spring on a full material cert on us. We have to go back to the customer and say, look, I'm sorry, we need to make these from scratch, so we have that full material traceability, we can't supply them on some stock. We can offer a certificate of compliance, obviously, but the full material traceability, the full material certs can only really be done for freshly made spray nozzles that what batch they're from. So again, understanding these time aspects of documentation and testing up front will reduce the delays that they actually cause and then produce any nasty surprises. Number 3, translation problems. And I'm not talking about language translation, I'm talking about different standards in different countries and different certifications that are required. The American standards are different to the European standards, for example. This can lead to problems if we assume that they're all very similar. And they're all aiming to achieve the same goal, quality and all of that. But they're different, there's subtleties there. And the solution here is to actually use a supplier that actually understands them all and talk about what's required up front. This is key in all of these. Talk about what's required up front in the process, so there's no nasty surprises later on down the process which can cause delays and additional costs. And then finally, the cost of documentation and testing. Now, sometimes it is assumed that this is all built into the quoted price for the spray nozzle. It's easy to see where this assumption comes from, because when you're used to buying large, expensive bits of kit, so say you're spending 250,000 or £1 million on something that's a big bit of equipment, it's a fairly reasonable assumption to assume that costs of the testing and documentation are built into the cost of that product, because the actual cost in doing the testing on something that's costing £250,000 or whatever is irrelevant. It's not a relevant part of the overall cost of the machine, whatever it is. However, if we're supplying £2,500 of spray nozzles, which is a common sort of size order for us, the 5 or 6 hours of testing and compiling the documentation is relevant. It is a significant part of the overall solution. So unless it's costed in, then it may not be possible to supply the spray nozzles at the originally quoted price. But most of the time, we will supply spray nozzles as a component with just a basic material cert. That's very, very common for us. So we don't automatically cost in all of the potential testing and documentation requirements that are necessary for larger critical products. So again, the solution here is don't assume. Don't spring testing and documentation regime on the spray nozzle supplier at the last minute, or slip it into the PO assuming that it's all covered in the cost. It probably isn't. So talk about the documentation and testing requirements up front, and then you can get an accurate quote from the nozzle supplier, and there's no nasty surprises and difficult conversations later on when the actual overall cost of the solution, including documentation, is quite a bit more than was originally quoted. We've had cases in the past where the documentation and testing of the spray nozzles actually cost more than the spray nozzles themselves. So it's over double the price that they would be just raw, fresh off the shelf spray nozzles without that documentation. So it can be a significant cost. So talk about it up front. So those are our tips for overcoming 4 common documentation and testing problems in spray nozzle specifications. As with most things, it's pretty much common sense here. Talk about everything up front. Don't make assumptions, and deal with a competent supplier who's done this many, many times before. Follow that advice and you won't end up with those annoying conversations about unexpected documentation charges or delays in production. So those are our 4 tips for overcoming 4 common documentation and testing problems.